You've probably heard the story of the Manhattan Project, right? The secret, high-stakes race to build the atomic bomb that brought World War II to an end. But have you ever wondered what happened the day after? What do you do when that single, all-consuming mission is just over? Well, today, we're going to dive into that, the incredibly chaotic, uncertain, and pivotal year that followed at the secret lab in Los Alamos. So our guide on this journey is a historical document from 1946, a progress report written by the lab itself. And as you can see, it was never, ever meant for the public. It's just crammed with technical jargon, dense organizational charts, and really dry official language. Yeah, not exactly a page-turner.
But if you're willing to dig a little, buried between all those lines of bureaucracy is this incredible story of crisis, of invention, and transformation. So that's what we're going to do in this explainer. We're going to pull that very human story out and see just how this secret outpost in the desert navigated the dawn of the atomic age that it had literally just created.
Okay, so picture it. It's late 1945. The war is won. The scientists who built the bomb are, for the moment, heroes. But back at Los Alamos, the mood isn't celebratory at all. It's actually one of deep, profound uncertainty. Their one and only purpose had just vanished overnight. So, now what?
I mean, the report itself uses this incredible phrase to describe the atmosphere. It calls it a complete psychological deflation. Think about that. After years of this intense 24/7 effort, everything just stopped. The document says that technical activity came practically to a standstill. The project that had just changed the world was suddenly adrift with no clear mission.
And this led to a massive identity crisis. The staff was completely torn. On one side, you had people who believed the lab's job was to build atomic weapons, and that this work absolutely had to continue. But then you had this whole other group who argued, no way, we should abandon weapons entirely and focus only on peaceful, basic research. And you gotta understand, these weren't just small disagreements. These were deeply held moral and philosophical debates about the very soul of the institution.
And the result of all this uncertainty? People left, in droves. The top minds of the Manhattan Project, the brilliant senior scientists, and the really experienced technicians, they all started packing up and heading back to their universities and their old lives. The lab was facing a brain drain so severe it threatened its very existence.
So the new leadership had two gigantic problems on their hands. First, they had to figure out a new mission, and fast. And second, they just had to keep the lights on. Because you have to remember, Los Alamos wasn't just a laboratory, it was a secret, totally isolated city that had been thrown together for the war. And now, the whole thing was threatening to just fall apart. This was the urgent, existential question facing the new director, Norris Bradbury. The wartime infrastructure was never meant to be permanent. Housing was a total mess. The people who decided to stay were feeling pretty demoralized. So how on earth do you convince the world's best scientists to stay in a makeshift town in the middle of nowhere with no clear purpose?
And the answer, amazingly, didn't come from the physicists. It came from the accountants and the administrators. See, the University of California ran the lab under contract, and its business office, the folks you'd expect to just be handling payroll and buying supplies, was suddenly tasked with basically inventing a functional community from the ground up.
And this is where it gets kind of wild. I mean, look at this list pulled right from the report. These guys weren't just managing research grants, they were running the town newspaper and the radio station. They were financing the nursery school, deciding who got the few available cars, and get this is a real detail. They had to settle a claim with a local rancher whose cattle had their hair discolored by the Trinity test. They weren't just managing a lab, they were building a society.
And just to give you a sense of the scale here, this wasn't some side project. The report shows that the simple check cashing facility they set up for employees was handling over $100,000 a month back in 1946. To put that in perspective, that's like $2 million today. Every single month. It was a massive, complex operation just to create some semblance of a normal life.
So, while the administrators were busy literally building a town, the lab was still bleeding talent and desperately needed a new scientific mission to rally around, and it found one in the summer of 1946. A new military directive came down that would give Los Alamos a renewed, if pretty controversial, sense of purpose.
And this was Operation Crossroads. The whole point was to test what atomic bombs would do to naval ships. Los Alamos was put in charge of providing the bombs, all the technical direction, and the scientific measurements. The report points out that this new goal, while, quote, not entirely welcome by everybody, had a huge psychological advantage. It gave them a job to do again, a real target.
And those tests, they provided a ton of new data. The report flags a few key takeaways. First, the bombs worked with a surprising efficiency, way better than they expected, and they didn't totally understand why yet. Second, that underwater shot, it demonstrated totally new phenomena, like that gigantic radioactive water column. And third, they saw a more penetrating radiation, which confirmed some really dangerous effects they'd observed back in Nagasaki.
Now, Operation Crossroads was all about testing the weapons they already had. But even while those tests were going on, another group back at Los Alamos was already looking ahead, focused on the next generation, weapons that at the time only existed in theory. The lab was, in effect, inventing the tools of the Cold War.
So, the biggest of these projects was codenamed the Super. What was the Super? Well, basically, it was the theoretical research into a weapon based not on fission, that's splitting atoms apart, but on fusion, which is forcing them together. This was the very beginning of the road to the much, much more powerful hydrogen bomb.
And the research really started picking up steam. In April 1946, the lab held this super secret conference, and the report lists an absolute who's who of physics at the time. You're talking about people like Enrico Fermi and Edward Teller, all gathered in one room to figure out if this super bomb was even possible. This was really the moment the H-bomb program started to become real.
But at the same time, they realized they needed new tools to better understand the bombs they already had. So the report talks about the design of a brand new fast neutron reactor. Why was that such a big deal? Well, a nuclear bomb is basically just a really, really fast reactor. This new machine would let them study the physics of systems that were right on the edge of going critical, but safely. And as the report makes very clear, this was brand new territory. No one had ever built a plutonium-fueled or a fast reactor before.
But all of this pioneering work, pushing the absolute boundaries of physics in a lab that was still kind of a construction site, it came at a terrible price. You know, these scientists were working with forces they were only just beginning to understand, and the margin for error was pretty much zero.
And during this period, Los Alamos suffered the first peacetime nuclear fatalities. In two separate, absolutely tragic accidents, physicists Harry Daghlian and Louis Slotin were exposed to fatal doses of radiation. They were performing these incredibly dangerous criticality experiments by hand, tests designed to see just how close a mass of plutonium was to going critical. It was work they literally called tickling the dragon's tail.
The impact of these deaths was immediate and profound. The report contains this stark directive from the lab's director, which basically says, stop all unsafe practices right now. I don't care how important the work is. These tragedies forced a fundamental shift in how the lab approached safety, and it really ended that early era of hands-on, cowboy-style experimentation.
So when you step back and look at this whole chaotic period, from late 45 through 46, you just see this stunning transformation. The lab went from being a temporary wartime project to a permanent institution. It went from a secret military base to a real managed community. Scientifically, it morphed from a single-focus factory into a center doing all kinds of diverse research. And of course, strategically, it pivoted from its wartime focus to getting ready for the Cold War.
Against all the odds, in just a little over a year, the lab had been pulled back from the absolute brink of collapse. But it wasn't the same place it was during the war, not at all. It had been fundamentally and permanently reshaped by the pressures of a brand new, very uncertain world.
And that leaves us with one last big question. As all the people at Los Alamos were fighting just to solve these immediate problems, housing, payroll, keeping the scientists from leaving, getting new experiments to work, did they have any idea of the bigger picture? Did they realize that in the middle of all that frantic chaos of 1946, they weren't just saving a lab, but that they were actually building the scientific and military engine that would go on to shape the next half-century of global history?